All right, well, I think I'm going to go ahead and get us started because it's 12:15, our advertised time, and I know that lots of you have to teach or have other things that you need to get to as soon as this talk is over. So thank you for being here. Congratulations to the Women's Center on celebrating its 40th anniversary and all of the great success and programming that the Women's Center has provided for us for all these years is much appreciated. My name is Mona Frederick, and I am the director of the Robert Penn Warren Center for the Humanities, and very happy to have such a full room to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is Stella Vaughn. This house, as you'll learn in this talk, the house you're sitting in right now, this is the house that Stella Vaughn grew up in. I have been working here for 30 years, an amazing statement, but it is a fact. So for 30 years, I have felt closer and closer and closer to Stella Vaughn as I have learned more about her story. A few caveats, you might say. When I talk about the history of women at Vanderbilt and the role of Stella Vaughn in this history, this is the story of white women at Vanderbilt. The first African-American woman to receive an undergraduate degree from Vanderbilt was Dorothy Wingfield Phillips, who received her BA in 1967. The first black female basketball player at Vanderbilt was Teresa Lawrence Phillips, and she joined the team in 1977. In 1979, Kathy Bender was the first African-American woman to receive a basketball scholarship from Vanderbilt. African-Americans in service positions were a part of the campus in the early days of its history, and Stella Vaughn often commented on their important roles and their dedication to Vanderbilt. However, in my research, I find her remarks are related only to African-American men. In fact, behind this house, where Stella lived for 28 years, was a two-room home that housed servants. Research done by our colleague Steve Warnke indicates that these servants' quarters were occupied by African-American women who served as cooks for the Vaughn family. Mary Clayton first, and then later Carrie Jones. And I'm so thankful we now know their names. My comments today about Stella Scott Vaughn are intended to be just a sketch of her life and her role in the early history of Vanderbilt. There is much more that could be written and assessed about various aspects of Stella's life. For example, how did Vaughn's role compare to other women physical education instructors across the country? Why, as historian Joan Holt has noted, were 90% of women physical educators not married in their years of service? Stella Vaughn never married, and there is no record of any romantic relationships. How were women's bodies policed and constrained during Stella's time? These are but a few examples of the larger story of Stella Vaughn that needs to be told. Lastly, Stella wrote much about the early history of the university, but she wrote very little about herself, stating often, "I do not wish to be perceived as writing my autobiography." So with those opening sort of disclaimers, Stella Scott Vaughn was a trailblazer for equal educational opportunities for women. Born November 4th, 1871, Miss Stella, as she was affectionately known throughout her adult life, came to live on the Vanderbilt campus with her family at the age of 10 and remained unfailingly loyal to, although sometimes critical of, the institution for the rest of her life. Stella's father, Professor William J. Vaughn, was hired by Vanderbilt in 1882 to fill the mathematics chair, one of 11 chairs in the academic department, now known as the College of Arts and Science. The Vaughn family, Professor William Vaughn, his wife Abby, and their 5 children, Eugene, Robert, William, Harry, and Stella, lived for 2 years in Wesley Hall, a grand building in the center of campus that housed the Vanderbilt Biblical Department and Library, 160 dorm rooms for professors and their families, as well as students, some lecture halls, and a very popular local cafeteria. According to Bard Thompson in the Vanderbilt Divinity School, A History, it had the look of strength and massiveness, with wings and towers and knobs and other ornaments representative of the era. Stella Vaughn wrote, "3 wings of the building were occupied by families of the professors. It was said long ago that you were not a real Vanderbilter unless you spent part of your life in Wesley Hall." In 1884, the family moved into their own residence on the campus, this one that had been previously occupied by Dr. T.O. Summers. The Vaughns lived in this campus home for 28 years. In 1925, Stella addressed the Vanderbilt Women's Club, recalling her early days as a child on the campus. "The latch string hung on the outside of our door, whose portals swung wide to faculty and students alike. When I was a little child, Bishop McTeer used to take me by the hand and walk along the paths, telling me the names of the many trees he watched with keen interest." Young Stella Vaughn received her early schooling with the other faculty members' children in a one-room school on the western edge of the campus, often referred to as Little Vanderbilt. Stella was always very athletic, and many referred to her as a tomboy. She liked to walk around the perimeter of the campus balanced on the tops of the board fences that surrounded the grounds. She also spent much of her youth climbing the many campus trees. Stella said, quote, "Nothing went on above or below ground on the campus during my growing up that I did not witness." In her handwritten notes from 1948 about growing up on campus, she mentions an encounter with a bricklayer in 1885 when she would have been about 14 years old. The first building enterprise on the campus after we came to Vanderbilt was the West Side Row Dormitories, named by the students the home of the people. Late one afternoon, I was watching one of the men lay the brick in a chimney, and I asked him if he would let me lay some of the bricks. And he said, "You can't get up here." Before he changed his mind, I was on top of the house. He turned over his trowel and mortar to me, and I laid 6 bricks. He said that I could beat a squirrel climbing. Well, I love that story because I love to imagine that perhaps the house that she put the bricks in is now the Women's Center. But I don't know, I made that up. But maybe. Stella Vaughn entered Vanderbilt University as a first-year student in 1892, one of 10 women in the academic department. There were about 180 male students at that time. Beginning that year, women were admitted by courtesy to the classes offered by the academic department. Although the women who were attending classes during this period were not allowed to matriculate, they could complete any of the degree programs offered and were subject to the same rules as their male counterparts. During Stella's days as a student at Vanderbilt, important changes regarding the status of women were underway. And here, Rory, we have some overlap from your talk. In 1894, the faculty voted 7-6 to allow women to compete for university prizes and awards. In 1895, a new record was set when 3 women graduated in 1 year. The year following Stella's graduation, the faculty voted to allow women the opportunity for formal matriculation. The women did not, however, have access to dormitories and lived in university-approved boarding houses near the campus. After her graduation in 1896, Stella remained on the campus as the Women's Physical Education Director, becoming Vanderbilt's first female instructor. In the fall of 1896, Stella Vaughn organized Vanderbilt's first women's basketball team and served as coach, player, and team captain. Stella was in charge. What motivated Stella to teach the women to play basketball, a game invented only 5 years previously? Here we have to speculate. In the fall of 1891, James Naismith famously invented the indoor game of basketball. Enthusiasm for the game spread swiftly, and by January 1892, the physical education journal, The Triangle, had published an article by Naismith about basketball. The winter sport quickly became part of the activities hosted by the YMCAs across the country, including in Nashville. The first account of Vanderbilt men playing basketball was reported to have occurred on February 7, 1893. The Vanderbilt Hustler published the rules of the game in its December 21, 1893 edition. Senda Berenson, the first woman enshrined in the Basketball Hall of Fame, began teaching women at Smith College in Massachusetts to play basketball in 1892 after reading Naismith's article. Berenson, later Abbott, however, felt the game too rough for the women, and she modified the rules so the game would be both womanly and vigorous. I don't know what that would be, but I feel it. She divided the court into 3 regions and prohibited players from leaving their assigned region. Players could not dribble more than 3 times, hold the ball for more than 3 seconds, or steal the ball away from an opponent, as this would have been unladylike. 3 seemed to be a really important number to Sarah Berenson, Senda. Just under a year later, the first interinstitutional women's basketball game was held between the University of California, Berkeley, and Miss Head's school. By 1895, hundreds of women's teams were playing around the country. A leading physical educator at Amherst College, Edward Hitchcock, supported women's basketball. He wrote, "Basketball," it used to be 2 words, "basketball seems to be a kind of complementary football game for woman development. It requires hardihood, alertness, quick perception, and volition without the excessive energies required for the men's game." Thank you, Mr. Hitchcock. The Division of Girls and Women's Sports of the American Association for Health, Physical Education, and Recreation urged Berenson to publish her modified rules. Berenson's adapted game became the official rule book for women athletes. In 1901, the Spalding Library published the rule book and continued to do so through 1919. I imagine that Stella Vaughn, the young, new physical education instructor at Vanderbilt, was following the news of this novel game and the development of the special rules for women. One of her first actions in her position was to teach the women to play basketball. However, her colleagues, all of whom were male, opposed Stella's plans, as they felt girls playing basketball would stain the university's name. Stella had a strong voice, though, and was able to strike a compromise. The women could play, but the men couldn't watch. This was true on several campuses around the country, by the way. In the first Vanderbilt women's game, played March 13, 1897, against Ward Seminary, an all-women's, essentially junior college in Nashville, a male reporter from the Vanderbilt student newspaper hid in the gym, and his stealth reporting resulted in the following account of the game. After the doors and windows had been barred and locked and a guard placed at each, time was called for the game to begin. Now I thought, we will see some scratching and hair pulling and hear a half a dozen screams. I was not deceived. They showed they were still girls. The local Nashville newspaper, relying on other eyewitness accounts, wrote, "The contest is said to have been one of spirit, evidenced by the sunny locks found on the floor later by the janitor." They're not done yet. There were no broken bones, black eyes, or scratched faces reported. Samuel Anderson Weekly, a member of the men's basketball team of 1909 and 1910, apparently had also witnessed that game, and he wrote, "The Vanderbilt team won by a score of 5-0. A field goal counted 5 points in the girls' game then. The game had gone 0-0 until just before the end, when Stella Vaughn threw a long pass to Elizabeth Badorf near her goal, and she in turn made a desperation throw." Weekly goes on to state that Stella Vaughn should be the queen to reign henceforth, sorry Candace, as Vanderbilt's Miss Basketball. Information is sketchy about the early years of Vanderbilt women's basketball program. Apparently, the women began playing a regular schedule in the early 1900s. Some reports say 1902, others say 1905. During this period, the doors were opened for women and men to observe the games. After 1910, and this is pretty huge, after 1910, the women's team traveled for away games against colleges in places such as Kentucky and Ohio. Reports about the games, including rosters and statistics, were regular features in the Vanderbilt Student newspaper. In some accounts, and this is super hard to say, so forgive me, in some accounts, the women's team was referred to as the Commodoresses. You try to say it. By the late 1920s, reports on the women's teams fade away, perhaps coinciding with Stella Vaughn stepping down from the position of head of physical education for the girls. Around the time that Stella was penning her reminiscences of the early days of Vanderbilt's history in 1948, when she handwrote this, plans were being developed for several new facilities on campus, including a new gym. She wrote, "Years ago, when I had charge of physical education for women, I realized then that we needed a new gymnasium. One day, my girls told me that they didn't know the rules in football, and they wanted me to explain the game to them. I lined up two teams against each other and explained the duties of the respective positions. I called signals for my team, and in a quarterback sneak, I started around the end of the opposing team when I was tackled by Ann Scales. She went into me with such a force that I slid across that pine floor for quite a distance. It took me weeks to get all the splinters out of my body." You can understand why I am enthusiastic over the idea of an up-to-date gymnasium. I love that image. Stella Vaughn served as the women's physical education instructor and basketball coach without pay for 9 years. In 1905, Chancellor Kirkland proposed that Miss Stella receive an annual salary of $100 for her work with the female students. 8 years later, shortly after the death of her father, the Board of Trusts voted to increase her salary to $200 a year. At the June 1913 meeting, Chancellor Kirkland stated, "I recommend that Miss Stella Vaughn be given $200 instead of $100 for her work with the young ladies. It is of great value to the young women studying at the university, and she has not measured her services by the time demanded of her according to her contract. She has not only taught them in gymnastics, but has supervised their sport and in a general way has acted as advisor and friend." Stella Vaughn's accomplishments and those of her girls came not without struggle. As women garnered more academic honors during the early 1900s, questions again arose about women's proper role on the campus. In 1914, the women outpaced the men, and this is going to sound like a lot of grade inflation as we've talked about, but the numbers were different then. But in 1914, the women outpaced the men with an academic average of 81.72% compared to the men's 71.47%. Women, this is remarkable, women won the Founders Medal in the academic department each year from 1908 to 1912. Chancellor Kirkland continued to believe that coeducation was harmful to the institution and hoped for a separate educational facility for women. "The girls at Vanderbilt have worked against the odds," wrote Miss Stella at that time, "but they are a plucky bunch and not easily discouraged. They have slowly but surely won a place for themselves by their perseverance. In May 1915, a faculty committee led by English professor Edwin Mims examined a host of issues affecting the women students. The committee was favorably disposed toward the women, and Mims recommended appointing a dean of women and establishing a social center for the female students. However, at the urging of Mims, the committee also recommended the abolishment of all women's intercollegiate athletics. Intramural sports and physical education were laudable, the committee wrote, but women's competitive athletic contests were not in keeping with the best tradition and practice of the entire country. The faculty tabled this recommendation, and Vaughn's teams continued to compete against other colleges. At the Board of Trust meeting in June of 1915, the trustees considered the Mims Committee's recommendation to hire an official dean of women. Stella was long considered the unofficial dean of women, although they took no action on the matter. However, the board did appoint an advisory committee for the women. The job of the committee, whose membership included Stella, was to assume a general attitude of advisors toward the young women, particularly the freshmen, and also, of course, to maintain a certain general oversight over the social life of all the women students. In addition to her role as physical education instructor, Stella Vaughn's 11-room home at 2122 Highland Avenue, which is over by the VA hospital, built for her by her brother Harry around 1915, was one of the approved boarding houses for female students. For more than 30 years, Vanderbilt boarders were a part of her home. She often tutored the students in French and German. When her contemporaries would complain about the young people of the day, Stella was quick to rise to their defense. Quote, "You are very much mistaken. Customs change, character never does. You have to stay in step with youth to understand that." When the university finally hired a dean of women in 1925, Ada Bell Stapleton, it was due to the work of the Alumni Council. Formed in 1923, the council sought certification from a very important organization called the American Association of University Women, the AAUW. In order to certify a chapter, the AAUW required that a campus meet 3 standards. Everything is 3, right? A dean of women, a women's dormitory, and physical education facilities for the women. Chancellor Kirkland refused to spend any of the university endowment earnings for these objectives, but he told the Alumni Council that if they could raise the money, he would work with them. The women, including Stella Vaughn, set about fundraising through various sales and gala presentations and whatnot. In 1925, they were able to pay $3,000 a year for a dean of women. In that same year, in his address marking the semi-centennial of the university, Kirkland reiterated his position that Vanderbilt was founded as an institution for men and that, quote, "its general tone and atmosphere is that of a college for men and will probably so remain," close quote. In 1926, same time period, Stella Vaughn spoke to the Vanderbilt Women's Club about the university's first 50 years. She spoke about her colorful childhood, memories on the campus, and the various people who had contributed to university life, including, among many others, Bowling Fitzgerald, porter of the Cassam Dormitory and football trainer, and Landon C. Garland, Vanderbilt's first chancellor. In this address, she praised the university for its recent hiring of a dean of women, but went on to talk about a campus tour of the future. Quote, "In closing, I want in imagination to take one more trip with you around the campus. In place of the old gymnasium," which is still here, "in place of the old gymnasium, there will be a commodious building with all conveniences and with swimming pools for both the girls and boys. And we observe a girls' dormitory, the removal of the professors' houses, additional science buildings, the second unit of the hospital, and in place of the old science hall and the residence in the rear, a magnificent library to which all roads will lead." Stella Vaughn was a founding member of the Kappa Alpha Theta sorority. Originally established on campus as the Phi Kappa Upsilon, the local independent sorority became a branch of Kappa Alpha Theta in 1904, the first in the South. Vaughn became the first initiated member of a national women's fraternity at Vanderbilt. She gave the group a small lodge next to her home on Highland Avenue to use for meetings and other social functions. Miss Stella served as advisor to the chapter for more than 50 years. Until her death in 1960, she gave the annual orientation talk to the sorority's new members. In addition to her many formal and informal roles that we've talked about, Stella Vaughn also chronicled much of the university's history. You can find many articles that she wrote over the years about the early days at Vanderbilt in Vanderbilt Library's special collections. For example, she wrote in great detail about the 1905 fire in Kirkland Hall, then called Old Main, and photographed the raging fire as well, and I found her photographs. Then this is Miss Stella's writing. A great calamity befell Vanderbilt in April 1905 when its main building was destroyed by fire. The cause of the fire was never determined. The fire was discovered by one of the campus force who was cutting grass nearby. He hurried to the chancellor's office and gave the alarm. The chancellor and the bursar went from room to notify the classes that were in session. There was a very high wind blowing from the southwest, and this drove the smoke away from campus. People came from all parts of the city to witness it. To look out on the north end of campus, you might have thought there was a camp meeting. I got some excellent pictures of the building while it was burning. Much to the disgust of the students, there was no disruption of classes on account of the fire. They had counted on having a holiday. But then she goes on to write in detail about where they moved all the classes the very next day and how there was no disruption. A campaign was in motion straight away to rebuild Old Main. Community members especially missed the bell tower clock and its hourly chimes. Children from the campus, and yes, we climbed up to the top of Kirkland Hall Tower to take this picture the other day. Thank you, Pat. Children from the campus and the nearby community donated funds to replace the bell. And so this is the new bell, but it dates to 1906. On the bell is inscribed, "A gift of the children to Vanderbilt University, 1906. Ring in the nobler modes of life." And that last is a line from a poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson. So now every time I hear that Kirkland Hall bell ring, I feel a different relationship to the sound and knowing that that line of poetry is on that bell. In the Stella Vaughn files in the library is a list, in her handwriting, of the children's names and the amounts they donated for the new bell. It was a lot of money. In 1958, Stella and her brother Harry Vaughn presented 26 volumes of clipping books to the joint university libraries, and they're still there. The scrapbooks, which the two had compiled over the years, contain newspaper clippings about the university and include a record of Vanderbilt and its faculty, staff, and students since its very founding. Stella Vaughn died in October 1960, a few weeks short of her 89th birthday. Vanderbilt University had been at the center of her interests for 78 years. Once asked about her relationship to the university, she replied, "This campus life is a very great privilege. It's the life of me." The Nashville Banner reported, "Miss Stella Scott Vaughn, the grand old lady of Vanderbilt University, is gone." In 1963, the university named one of the 4 new women's dormitories in the Margaret and Harvey Branscombe quadrangle the Stella Vaughn House. In 2015, 119 years after she first accepted the position of unpaid physical education instructor at Vanderbilt, Stella Scott Vaughn was enshrined in the Vanderbilt Athletic Hall of Fame. May her spirit continue to haunt us. So thank you for coming. I'm not an expert on Miss Stella, but just having been here for 30 years and sitting in her house, I felt like I needed to get to know a little bit about her, and I'm happy to share that with you. If anybody has questions, I'm happy to answer them, but again, I am not necessarily an expert on any of these topics or thoughts that you might have.
That was fascinating. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Really interesting. I had no idea about that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We really don't know a lot about her, and so I think it's good that we have this opportunity to talk about her legacy, and I hope that somebody someday will write something much grander about her and all these other questions that exist about women's roles at that time.
Is she mentioned in the book? Who wrote the book about Vanderbilt? The history department.
There's a passing reference to her. She was quite a campus legend, though, as you can tell. I mean, from the remarks and from the reports about her in the newspaper. She was very involved at West End Methodist Church. She laid the cornerstone for the new building. I just decided I needed to find out where she was buried, and she's buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery, and I intend to go out there and pay a visit. But no, Conkin doesn't deal much with the history of women in Gone with the Ivy.
Do you know anything about her family, like living relatives?
Her brother William, she had those 4 brothers, but I think they were older than she was, and so really only Harry, her next, Stella was the youngest, and then Harry was just above her. They had a great influence here in Vanderbilt. Her brother Harry Vaughn was a dentist who had to get out of that work for his health. I don't know what that means exactly, but he went on to be a building contractor in town, and he was a famous bird egg collector. And he and Stella loved to climb the trees and collect the birds. And he founded the Cumberland Science Center, which is now the Adventure Science Center. That was founded by him, and I found a fundraiser that they were doing for that, and there was a picture of Stella with Minnie Pearl. So that was kind of fun. Her brother Harry had 3 sons. And the other 3 older boys, we don't really have their history. But her brother Harry had 3 sons who were also very important to Vanderbilt's history. The most important is a son named William, who was named after his grandfather. And he went on to be the chair of the Vanderbilt Board of Trust. He was the first student to graduate from Vanderbilt with all A's. And it was William Vaughn who made the motion at the Board of Trust to admit Bishop Joseph Johnson as a student. And so I love that the Bishop Joseph Johnson Center is right next door and the Vaughn house is here, because there is a connection between those 2 people. Then there were some William and his 2 brothers had children who moved to Kansas City and different places, and then we've just lost track of the family.
When we inducted her in the Hall of Fame, we found like a great niece, maybe, who lives in Mount Juliet, who found, she came to the induction ceremony and she had a box of some of her things. It'd be nice to connect you all so you could see some.
Yeah, it would be nice.
Really didn't know the stories.
Yeah, it would be nice to meet her. I talked about that with someone who recently retired from the athletic department. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name. Rod.
Rod is the one who found it.
And then he retired and we kind of lost that connection, so if you all... Yeah, that'd be great. We'll put her on the golf cart. All right, well, thank you very much. I know you have other things you need to do, so thanks again for coming, and we look forward to our next event. Do you want to mention that, Rory?